As is our new tradition, we start announcements at 1 minute before the official introduction of the seminar. So our only announcement today is come to our semester kickoff tea time today at 3:30 in the billiard room. 3:30 today.
That sounds dangerous.
What we serve.
And no candlesticks in there or anything.
And now Ron will introduce our speaker today, Hans.
So, you see most of the information about Hannes up here on the screen. Hannes just started as an assistant professor in economics at the University of Zurich. And before that, he was a postdoc at Princeton for several years. And he did his PhD in European University, but it was in Spain, and then LSE, something like that. Yeah, and you've spent some time at LSE as well. And I've had, an ongoing email correspondence with Hannes over recent months, but this is the first time we've met. Hannes, I'm not sure how he would describe his field of concentration, but I would say, okay, it looks like economic demography to me. But that's true of a lot of labor economics, so you probably consider yourself a labor economist. And he's done papers on quite a wide range of topics in economic demography. Some of these are co-authored with Janet Curry, like the paper that will be presented today. Others done with other people. He has a paper on income and population growth on its way out. He has a paper on the effect of unemployment on fertility in the US. He has a paper on the effect of the dust clouds that occurred at 9/11 in New York, on outcomes of people who were affected in utero, something like that, and many other interesting topics. So today he's going to be talking about a topic that has been getting increasing attention in the last few years, this inequality in mortality in the US, and whether it's the differences are increasing or decreasing, whether they're wide or narrow, and so on. And so I'm looking forward to hearing this talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for this invitation. And yeah, as I said, I came from Zurich, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but I'm very generously compensated by this wonderful weather and this great opportunity to present this research here. So Janet and I became interested in this inequality in mortality because there has been a lot of debate, or actually I think some kind of agreement that inequality has been increasing over the past decades. While when we look at child development, child health in the US, we see many examples of policies that seem to work and where the poor are getting better off. So we were a little bit interested in how these two different developments fit together. And then also, if you just look at overall life expectancy at birth over the last 20 years, for women and men, you see quite a positive development, right? Things have been increasing steadily. And one might now think, well, maybe this is all driven, let's say, old age, mortality, maybe some rich people get even better treatment and have an additional year of life and so on, but nothing is really happening for the poor. But then if we split this up by age groups, different the mortality rates, different age groups. By the way, this is from the Human Mortality Database, because one should every day go there and play around with numbers. What you see here is these strong decreases, strong improvements in mortality across all ages, in particular actually at young ages, like infant mortality and during childhood, where we know this is they are very low for rich people, and it's a field that is more problematic for like poorer people. So we thought, that sounds like improvements that have happened over the past 20 years, in particular maybe for the poor. And so in light of these kind of very aggregate numbers, it's interesting that there has been like this great deal of recent research and also public interest about increases in inequality, life expectancy and mortality over the past 20 years. And I'm just like putting a few very recent papers here. This is Ron Lee's report for the National Academy of Sciences. But of course there are like many more studies. But I mean, just for example, I mean, they have also drawn a lot of media interest, for example. I mean, Ron's study was, of course, in the New York Times, I think, as well. And then, like a few weeks after that, followed by Amy Steaton and case study. So, but importantly, many of these studies focus on adults, and often like on older ages. So old age rather than on the whole life cycle. And we thought, like, particularly our interest in particular, like at these younger ages. And then also another caveat is that many of these, like some studies, have particular focus on subgroups defined by stuff like education, race, and location. And as we show, and it's also quite well known, is there are problems with these subgroups because it's difficult to define comparable groups over time, because like the composition changes in these groups, and also in some cases even the characteristics and how they are defined or how they're reported in surveys change over time. And so we use instead an approach that is based on groups of counties that can be adjusted over time so that they represent constant shares of the population. But before I show you exactly what we do and what we find, let me briefly show you a few cases of like studies what have been done before and the typical caveats, even though I might be able to go very quickly through this, as probably many of you know some of these
In other
studies.
words, groups of counties, could you just give us a little hint of what that means?
Well, just like that, we go into every year and then we group counties, like we rank them by poverty, by their poverty rate, but we could also rank them by other indicators, and then we just group them into bins of like of the same population size, more or less. And then we follow, let's say, the counties, the poorest counties that represent, let's say, 5%, the top 5%, and the top bottom 5% over time, and look how the life expectancy and mortality at these different ages develops. So one study that has drawn a lot of attention was this Olshansky et al. 2012, I think in Health Affairs paper, that finds, as the New York Times titled, that lifespan shrinks for least educated whites in the US. So they summarize their researchers have long documented that the most educated Americans were making the biggest gains in life expectancy, but now they say mortality data shows that lifespans for some of the least educated Americans are actually contracting. So not only we see an increase in mortality, but the life expectancy for the poorest is actually falling. And this was like the central figure. Probably some of you have already seen this. Here on the y-axis you have life expectancy, 99, 2000, 2008, and on the x-axis you have years of education. So for and this is for like white females, non-Hispanic white females, age 25 plus, and we see that for highly educated white women, these strong increases in life expectancy. Even for those who only have like 12 years of education, but then we see this really strong decline in life expectancy for this lowest group who are high school dropouts. Yes?
How are deaths before age 25 treated in these populations?
So they, I think they just like assume that they're all like they have the same death rates.
There's nothing going on before age 25.
Yeah. I mean, it would be better, I think, if they would just say life expectancy at age 25.
Okay.
But and also, I mean, then I think they stop at age, they only observe up to deaths up to age 80 or something, and then afterwards they have to make more projections. So, but of course, it sells better if you just have like pretend to do the whole thing. But the biggest problem is actually that when you see this, it's like, oh, this group of white non-Hispanic women with high school dropouts, it's getting worse off, you immediately think like, well, the group is also changing over time, right? And you can easily check this in the census, and here I just plotted for the same groups, the same time, instead of life expectancy, the population share, and we see that this group decreased by 66%. So it's really kind of, that's a big success story, right? This is exactly what we want. We want this group to get smaller, but of course people who are still left here, they might be very different than the average person in there, right? It's really just like kind of like the really difficult cases of people maybe that have health problems and so on, and that's why they cannot finish high school. So yeah, what are the caveats for these kind of studies? It's that the compositional change is a problem. Then another issue is that life expectancies is based usually, like in these kind of studies, on the on two data sets, vital statistics and the census for the population estimates, and the way education and race is reported changes. I will talk more about race later on, but education, for example, they change in one data set from years of education to degrees, or sometimes they are like missings, and then the missings change over time, and all of this stuff introduces biases in mortality rates, which then changes over time, and then you get like trends in mortality rates, which might not be really trends, but just like biases in these kind of measures. Then this already was brought up, we only observe education at the mid-20s, and you cannot say anything about earlier ages. So then the question is, what else is reported, or more consistently? And one thing that is consistently reported in both data sets is the county of residence. And this is what we're going to use, and actually it has been used before by other studies. And one caveat, and I want to talk about this Schwandt et al. Paper in 2013, is that what they have done is they have just looked at individual counties and looked at how life expectancy changed, and then they ranked counties by their change in life expectancy. Like, oh, these are the 20 counties where life expectancy increased most. These are like the success stories. And these are counties where life expectancy was falling. This is like the poor that are just like falling behind. And then they look at the spread between these two and see, oh, it's increasing. And this is like widening gaps in mortality inequality. But one problem again is that maybe the people who live in these counties might change, right? For example, just like the population might change. And this is again something we can check easily in the census. So this shows the population growth between 2010 and 1990. On the x-axis you have the county population. Here are the small counties, and then you have like fewer and fewer like really big counties. And this is the population growth. And on average we see it's like 18% growth over that period. And now let's start with two counties that had been picked actually by the New York Times story, because they are right next to each other, and the report, like this paper, shows that one had increasing, the other one had decreasing life expectancy, which is Fairfax in Virginia and McDowell in West Virginia. And we see that they were picked quite well, right? Because Fairfax has like almost twice as much population growth as the average US, and McDowell is like really this negative outlier, right? We see like a decline by 37%. And that's systematic. So these are, the red dots are all the counties where we see a decrease in life expectancy, like the top 20, bottom 20 counties, and the yellow points here are the top yellow counties. So they grow on average 67%, and the bottom line grows on average only 1%. So that means like if you just kind of like cherry pick individual counties, you might not really get like a good picture of actually what's going on in the overall society. So what we do instead is that we follow mortality across all ages in groups of counties, as I said, and follow them over time. So we follow the counties with the poorest counties with 5% population, with the richest counties with 5% of the population, and see how mortality changes in them over time. And we reorder them so that they represent constant population shares. So let's say if people move out of some poor counties and then they represent less of the population, then we stuck in more counties into this group to keep it constant. Yes?
Sorry, can we look back at the list, the ranking list? So I think Sam Preston and Irma Elo had this point about New York City, and you've got 3 of the counties there and the boroughs that it's an increasing, I think, an increasing foreign-born share.
Oh, okay,
That's
this as
attributed,
well.
yeah, that's part of the story with increasing life expectancy. And so it's the quality and not necessarily the size of the population that I think they were sort of pointing
That's
toward.
okay. That's also a good idea. I think, like in general, so we don't distinguish between foreign-born and U.S.-born, so we look at everyone. But also, I think there's this general question of what we want to measure, because you can never measure the same person twice because you only die once, unfortunately, right? So, and this is really a little bit confusing, at least to me. It's like often we think about, oh, how does income change over time? And then you can look at individual people in groups or something, but theirs is really just happening once, and then you're out of the sample. And so, are we interested only in US-borns? But we cannot say one US-born person health at some point and whatever 10 years later because either dead or not, but like then saying we are only interested in US-born people because they are more interesting than foreign-born people or something. So I think that's why we are at that point agnostic. But I think it's a very good point that this can also drive changes in population health. Yes.
Could you say a word about the measurement, the denominator and the numerator? How do we know where someone dies? Is where someone dies where they live? Is this a big problem or a small problem?
So I think it's not. So the information where they live in the vital statistics, you know the county of death where it occurred, but also the county of residence, and we even know the state of birth, but like that doesn't really help. But we use the county of residence because in the census they also try to find people's county of residence or like count them there. So in general, I think that is not the biggest issue. But I think a bigger issue is if you look at individual counties, that you will have, especially when you look at individual age ranges, you might have a lot of noise because you have like cases with 0 deaths or like just like very small cells. And they have actually this life expectancy data I think has been criticized for that, because then they use all kind of like county measures of income and so on to predict this. But we construct our own life expectancy data, and because we have these county groups, so we first make these county groups and then we calculate life expectancy, and that helps. But actually if we use their data we get also very similar results, at least for these groups. Yeah, so I mean this is already like what we just talked about. So advantages of the county analysis: it's consistently reported, then we have sufficient cell size, and then also at the county level we have all these socioeconomic indicators, right, from the census or the ACS, which we don't have on the birth certificates, on the death certificates, sorry. And so what we do is that we rank counties by poverty or by like another indicator, and then divide them into equal shares of the overall population. And this is, for example, how it looks like for, this is the poverty quantile in 1990, so this is like the richest, this is the poorest quantile. Here we have percentiles, so this is like when we have 100 groups, and we see the population in millions. There is some noise because, of course, like the counties don't fit perfectly into these bins, right? So we will have some overlap. Sometimes one group is too big, then the next group is a little bit too small. But on average, the noise is not too much. And we'd only make 20 groups, then we see it's even smoother, in a sense. So the data we use is like we use the vital statistics mortality data, death certificates. It includes county of residence, as I said, also age, gender, race. I will say something about this later on. We don't use it at the beginning. And we construct 3-year mortality just, again, to make sure that we don't have like small cells where like no deaths occur. And then we take the decennial census. the tabulation, so it's like the full sample. And then we create a life expectancy based on 5-year age groups. And as I said, we compare it with the other data set. And county characteristics we get from the census, and then like later on from the ACS, because the census, the decennial census, is like changed to a short form in 2010 and has much less information. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that you reorder the counties in order to keep the quintiles, the quintiles the same population size. But do you reordering, does that mean that some counties like get richer and others get poorer as well?
Yeah.
Moving them around at the same time, because like for example, North Dakota had an oil boom, so you have a spike in income.
Yeah. So this can happen, and in general, I have to say that whether we reorder them or whether we keep them with 1990 fixed, I will only show you the reorder results. But keeping things 1990 fixed doesn't even make such a big difference in the end. But I mean, there are these cases where things are switching, and then the question is always, I mean, there's probably the philosophical question: is it like, has the world improved if someone gets better, but someone else gets a little bit less worse or something? But yeah, it doesn't matter too much in the end. So this shows life expectancy at birth across poverty percentiles for men and for women in these 3 different years. So on the x-axis here we have the poverty percentile. 0 is the richest group, 100 is the poorest group, and so we see that the life expectancy is of course decreasing with poverty. And the blue dots here is 1990. The line is just like fitted, like a linear fit. Then 2000, I omit the dots so that we can see still something, but that's like the 2000 fit, and the green dots are the 2010 fit. And in general, a steeper slope means more inequality, right? Like if there was no inequality at all, it would just be flat. And so what we see here for men is that we see strong improvements in life expectancy across the entire poverty spectrum, because for every percentile. And also we see that it seems quite a parallel shift, right? In fact, as I will show in a moment, the increase is a little bit stronger actually for the poorer, but overall, I mean, the main message here is there have been improvements and not really any divergence or a strong convergence. For women, we see a similar picture, but of course, first they start at a higher baseline, then there is less of an improvement, like there's less of an increase, and we do see that the green line, the green slope is a little bit steeper, right, than the blue slope, meaning that inequality increased a little bit. Now, it's if we talk about these changes, it's better to plot the changes directly, and so the next figure I will do this, but have also the levels there, and I switch from these 100 bins to 20 bins just to have less noise, and put them both into one figure because you can actually do this. So these two become this left figure here. So now that's man, that's woman, and we just have the 20 dots, and here we have the change. So just like for every, I think it's then called a ventile. So every represents 5%, we have 20 dots. It's just like the change in life expectancy.
Sorry, the change is a percentage or is it year?
So this is the absolute change, and I will show the percentage change next. Okay. Because actually here the men have a lower base, right, and like the poorer have a lower base. So then this change will be bigger, and this will be like mean more convergence. But we do see that. We see this negative slope for women, meaning that the improvement was stronger for richer than for poorer women, meaning an increase in inequality. But for men, we see this slight increase, meaning that there was, if anything, some convergence. And this is like the slope and the p-value, so it's not significant for men. For women, it's significant at the 5% level. Meaning here that like if you switch from the poorest to the richest, then, or let's say other way, we switch from the richest to the poorest, then we will have about 1 year less of improvement, and for men it's actually half a year more of life expectancy improvement. And this is the same if we now look at percentage changes instead. then we see here that for men it's also significant, right? Because now the poorer have a lower base, so the percentage change, the same absolute change will be stronger for the poorest because they have a lower life expectancy baseline. And then we see that going from the richest to the poorest will lead to an additional 1.3% life expectancy for men and 1% less for women.
So conceptually, you're tagging deaths in a particular period to conditions in a particular period, but I mean, how are you thinking about the fact that deaths are in some sense generated by conditions much earlier in time, across the life course?
Yeah, and I think, so this will be like kind of the next point that I want to make, on that we should look at like individual age, like mortality at individual age bins. And I will come to this back later on. And I think in general is that if we are really interested in what has happened in the last 20 years, then we should be cautious about things that trends that we see at old age, because a lot of this, what you said, will be determined maybe 50, 60 years ago. But if we look at children and at infants, and this is like where we see the convergence, this is much more likely to present current things because they haven't had any time, and also like a lot of stuff happens like in utero, so kind of instantaneously for those who are born. And that's actually why I think it's overall kind of a positive pattern that we see about like how the society developed. But I will say more about this. But overall, I mean, like, this is probably the one place where you don't have to explain that life expectancy is a period measure and does not tell you anything about the future, and summarizes a lot of things into one measure. And yeah, and it's probably it makes sense to look at the individual age range. So overall, good news. Strong improvement across the entire poverty spectrum. There is some divergence for women, and then maybe even some convergence for men, or like nothing happening. So then the question is, of course, how does these results square with the findings from these previous papers that find strong divergence? And what they do is that, as I said, they look at older ages, and so of course life expectancy could mask these heterogeneous developments at different ages, and that's why next I want to show you first life expectancy at age 50, and then age-specific mortality. So this again, just going one back, this is life expectancy at birth, and I show the same thing with life expectancy at age 50. And remember here, this graph goes up, this goes down. Now, if we look at age 50, we see that both kind of like changes are sloping downwards, meaning that we also see for men these strong divergence, and for women as well. And it's like even like now we see like a 4 or 3% difference in improvements between the richest and the poorest. So like much stronger divergence, and a divergence for men and women. This is, oh, now it's difficult for those in the back. You just have to believe me when I tell you. But so this is for all the different age groups now, and mortality rates. So in this case, lower mortality is an improvement, like it's better. But again, it's like if we see, and of course now they're upward sloping because poorer places have higher mortality. But again, it is like that a steeper slope is more inequality, right? Like a flat slope would be no inequality. And what we see here, the blue line is 1990 and the green line is 2010. I see these strong downward shifts, like at young ages, like age 0 and like here up to age 20, and also kind of like a fair, how do you say, flattening of the slope, right? Suggesting that there is convergence. So this is kind of like good news. Now we go to the 20s to 40s. We still see flattening of the slope. But in particular here for these richer counties actually, we don't see so much of an improvement. But of course this is also like a very low baseline level. Yes?
So this is men and women combined?
No, sorry, this is men, and I will show a woman in the next one. And then, but there's still like this convergence maybe up to something like age 50. Then here's a period like in the 50s, 60s where it's just like a parallel shift, and then maybe here's some kind of divergence later on. Which that explains that if we look at at E50 why we see a divergence for men. Now the same thing for women. Oh, and we can also like show this in like summarize this. So this is like these different age groups. This is the mortality at the median county group. So if we just say we go to poverty 50 and look what's the mortality rate in 1990, and this is in 2010. That's the p-value of the difference if you just like use these fit regression lines, and that's the percentage change. And here we see like these strong improvements, like decreases in mortality for everyone. And these are the slopes, the corresponding slopes. And here we see slope in 1990, slope in 2010, the p-value of the difference, and this is the percentage change in the slope. And here we see like these strong improvements, right? These strong declines, like you could say the gap decreases by more than half in these young ages, and then it kind of like not significant anymore in the age rate 45 to 60, and then we have these increases in the gap for older ages. Yes?
And this does not have any information by income gradient. This is taking the 50th, the median income.
And so this is the median income here, but this one, sorry, this may be a bit confusing. So all what I do is, these are based on these slopes, on these slopes.
Probably gradient.
Yeah, and the left side was like when I compare the distance between the two, but the right one was the slope, so this was the gradient.
I see.
Yeah. So this part is the slope. You say like mortality increase per poverty percentile, just like this fitted slope. And just telling us that here the slope is, sorry, like these are like so many numbers. It's always like when you look at this.
I understood the left to be the average gap over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not the slope at all. It's just
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
time slope.
No, this is exactly. This is the gap between the two, and this is how the slope changes. Right? This is like the slope in 1990, and then the slope in 2010, and we see that it's decreasing, and in younger ages, and then like not much going on, like in like 50 to 60, and then in older ages, increasing. And of course, there are a lot of deaths in that range, so that's why it's also impacting life expectancy quite a lot, even though if you compare like in percentage terms and relative terms, much more happened at these younger ages. For women we see a similar picture, but there are like some differences and they're actually quite dramatic. So again, like for young ages we see the strong improvements and a decline in poverty and in mortality. But now between something like 20 to 50, there is very little mortality improvement. Actually, there are some ranges where we see increases. So for example, here we see strong increases in mortality. No, wait, this is not... where is a good example? Here we see actually increases for like the richer counties. But here, well, it's just like at individual points you see that actually the 2010 dot is over the 1990 dot. But I mean the overall message there is that even though we had of course technological improvements and all these things, and for sure also like safety improvements on highways and so on, there has been very little going on over 20 years, and in some cases even mortality has increased. Which is in line with like these findings by Uncase and Angus Deaton about that like in these middle age ranges things might actually not have gone better, and then they look at certain races and where things have actually worsened, as they say.
So were Case Deaton just finding this among women? Because
no, they
so this is actually not consistent with it.
Well, I mean, they don't split it up for man and woman, and they don't really make this point. But I think I think like I'm quite convinced that it's stronger for women than for men.
Yeah, that's what. But yeah, they distinguish between men and women, and they focus on men. But it's been shown later on that it's actually stronger for women. And then there were issues about age distribution in this group because they combined like 3 age groups, and there was a big change in the age composition.
Oh yeah, this was another thing. Yeah, I will actually show something else which is like problematic about race, but I think it's just like the fact that we see whether it's like now an increase in mortality or just like a very small decrease in mortality. It's just like that these don't look so good here, right? It doesn't look like a very a very great improvement in mortality. And then the other interesting thing is that we see a change in the trends, like from convergence here to divergence already much earlier, around already the 40s or something. There we see already like better, more improvements for the poorer than for the richer areas. So this happens about like 10 to 20 years earlier than for men in terms of the age. And then we see these really strong increases in the mortality gap. Interestingly, in a way that these things were flat, right, in 1990, so there was pretty much no kind of gradient in mortality, but then suddenly a gradient occurs. Even though we can also say there has been a lot of improvement for everyone. It's not like that these people are much worse off, but like the improvement has been much stronger for the richer groups.
Is there a reason you think about the absolute mortality rate rather than the log mortality rate?
I mean, I think that's a good question. And if we do this with logs, it looks similar. It's a little bit less pronounced, these kind of like converging trends, right? Because you will see that like this decrease will be a little bit lower because they start from a higher rate. But in general, we think it's good. Like if you take relative mortality rates as kind of like the gold standards for like these trends, you say that one death that occurs among poor people doesn't count as much as a death among rich people, just because there are so many deaths around anyhow among poor people. And we think it's better to just like value everyone the same in a sense, and say if one poor person dies less among poor people, it's the same success as if one person dies less among rich people. Maybe it's even more of a success. But I think if you do relative rates, then and also the thing with relative rates, as we saw, like with the life expectancy, if you look at it the other way around, survival, right, then it goes in the other direction. So yeah, but yes.
But on the other hand, you've got these huge changes of the age ranges where mortality is higher, and smaller absolute changes where mortality is lower. And if you took log forms, you might, those differences across age might be.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, like if we would scale it all on the same y-axis, you wouldn't see anything there, right? It would all be flat, and then we would certainly be taking log rates. So yeah, if someone said you have to put the same scale, we would definitely take logs.
So we have a bit more than 10 minutes
okay.
left. I don't know how much more you have to get through, but maybe we should hold our questions until you get to finish.
Okay, yes. So here's again these big tables. Here we see again strong improvements in the level shift, but not so much in these middle age ranges. So there's only like the 1 digits or like around 10%, even though here it's like 40 and 20%. And here we see that, remember, negative change means convergence, and that the convergence takes place only up to age 40 or something, even though for men it was up to age 60. And here we see these increases for higher ages, so just like shifted earlier. So one thing then we have looked at was race-specific mortality, and I thought race is really kind of like the one other thing that besides county is kind of like a safe bet to look at as a characteristic. But then, of course, there are also problems. Everywhere there's always problems, but there are more problems than I expected. So one thing was that the county allows the census allows for race combinations in 2000. So in 1990 people said I'm white, but then in 2010 you could say I'm white alone or I'm white and another race. And of course it means that if you look at the white alone people, that is understates the number of people who were before white, and if you look at white plus other race, that overstates them, right? And because this is the denominator, the mortality rate, and there's nothing happening in the numerator in the vital statistics, there's no change, then mortality rates will be biased mechanically. And then the question is, does it matter in terms of magnitude? And so what I did was just like look at overall mortality for men and women, for white men and women in this age range where we saw actually maybe some increases, and just check like whether they're constructed with white alone and white and other race. So this one is when we use white alone, This is man, this is woman, and this is age 30, 34, 25, 29. Yeah, so like this age range. And we see improvements here in mortality, but then actually mortality increased again to 2010. And also for women. Now if we use white plus other race, so the other extreme in a sense, we see actually that there's like this continuous decrease. Which, if you then look at trends and want to make a big statement, has it increased or not, and so on, we think it's kind of problematic. And I would really like to talk more about this with you over lunch, because you're experts on this, and I just don't know how puzzling this is. But we thought like maybe we don't make big claims on these subgroups. And another thing is Hispanic ethnicity. So one thing there, this is usually based like on the ACS, these population estimates, because they have like more information, fine information on the Hispanic origin. And in 2008, the question switched from Hispanic to Hispanic origin, and this, they said themselves, likely identifies people who where before, like when they were US born, they didn't say they're Hispanic. But if you ask them, are they Hispanic origin, they suddenly say yes, because my grandfather is from Mexico or something. So it could be that suddenly you get more people saying they're Hispanic origin. The question is, how can you identify them? How can you figure this out in the data? And what we thought is we can just follow cohorts of US-born Hispanics over time, right? People who say they're born in the US, and of course they shouldn't, that group shouldn't increase. It should not be affected by migration. It should, if anything, decrease a little bit because of mortality or something. And so this is a certain cohort that we follow over time, like that is around 20 in 1990, that we see in 2000, and this is Hispanic Whites. This includes the race combinations. Here we see already the effect of like allowing for combinations. But then in 2008, there's already actually a pre-trend and a trend afterwards, but this really big jump is like, that's 50% or something of the people who suddenly appear and say, hey, I'm also of Hispanic ethnicity. So, and of course now imagine what happens to mortality rates, right? Like everyone will say, wow, suddenly these Hispanic folks, they're like so healthy, they don't die anymore because the denominator got so big. How much time do I have? It's just
Well, you have 8 minutes.
Okay, oh, that's
7 or 8
great.
minutes.
Okay. Yeah, this is also like I have 2 slides left. So we don't dig too deeply into potential causes because we think there are like so many and like it's such a big kind of field to study that it would be kind of like ridiculous to say, oh, now we look at one and find that it's really important or not or something. But of course it's important to think about these things. And interestingly, there's not too much research on causes for like these mortality improvements among young children and adults that looks at like overall society trends, but also because people haven't really looked at this beforehand. So we think this is a field where a lot could be done. And as I said, we know from individual programs and individual studies that there have been a lot of improvements, for example, in the healthcare expansions, and there have been like nutritional programs, social safety nets such as Head Start, and also reduction in pollution and maybe also infectious diseases that in generally always are like worse for the poor because they're more exposed to it, they're more vulnerable to it, and so there are many reasons why we might see these strong improvements in mortality. Then this dramatic development in middle age that has been like highlighted by Anke's and Angus Deaton, which is there, like no matter which kind of like, maybe there might be a little difference whether you take this race alone or race together combination and so on, but overall we see that like the improvements suddenly stall, and maybe there's even an increase in mortality, or like at least it's like stagnant. And this has been very convincingly linked to the opioid epidemic, where suddenly people get addicted from prescription drugs, and this is now, I think, a multitude higher than like the crack epidemic and the heroin epidemic in previous decades. And it's really something that is, it's I mean, really mind-blowing because it doesn't happen at all in Europe. It happens a little bit in Canada, and yeah, it pours like billions of dollars into pharmaceutical companies, and it's really kind of like the, I don't know, well, you wouldn't think that this is possible in the 21st century in a sense. But yeah, but this can explain this, but at the same time one also has to say, in absolute terms, it's like not so many people that die, just like that of course, you have like very low mortality rates baseline, so you have big percentage changes, but I wouldn't say that this development is like driving out like all these positive developments that we see at younger ages. And then when we look at old ages, the disparities there, it has been argued, or like as partly shown, that smoking could be a main driver there in what we see at old ages right now. And the reason for this is that smoking rates have declined in the past century, but first for richer people and then for poorer people. And so now there's this time window where among the elderly, those rich people enter old age that stopped smoking, while the poorer still are smoking more, like not smoking that haven't decreased smoking. And so we see in old age these cohorts where smoking diverges among these groups. And that's actually also what we can see in my data, when I can just like show you. So this is just like the smoking trends across year of birth. So for birth cohorts, for men and for women, and this is people above the poverty line, below the poverty line. It's from the NHIS, so we can't do a count analysis, but like we know people's income, and we see that the smoking declined for relatively richer people already starting in the 1930s, but then the poorer people, they only followed in then around 1950. And for women, interestingly, this whole pattern has shifted. And when we then look at just like the people in 1990, 2000, 2010, so the time period that we are looking at, that are age 50 and plus, so this group where we see this divergence in mortality, right? We see that for men, at the beginning of the period, rich and poor men were smoking the same rates, but then poor people decreased, but rich people decreased more. So there's like an increasing gap in smoking rates. And for women, it's even more dramatic. Poor women smoked less at 1990 in that old age, but then rich women declines a little bit, while poor women actually increased their smoking in these cohorts that entered old age. So this can really explain part of the divergence that we see right now in old age during the past 20 years. And then this is the same figure, but for age 18 to 30, so people who are now young, who will be old in the future. And here we see smoking rates are much lower, and they're much more like they're converged, right? So the idea is maybe what is the same thing that has first. This is a success story, right? This is great. This is like public policy that worked, and it's great that people stopped smoking. But just because there was some lag, we have now a period when there is convergence in smoking, divergence in smoking in old age. But once these people enter old age, this problem will be solved, right? And like things might look much better. So let me just my last slide, finish with this. The bright bottom line. So it seems that poor children and young adults are catching up, and that policies seem to work. And since we know that early childhood has like these positive long-term effects, we might optimistically hope that these are cohort effects that carry on into old age, so that once they get to the old age, that they are much healthier. Then, if the old age divergence we see right now, as I said, is driven by smoking, but the smoking divergence will go away anyhow. I mean, this is like perfectly predictable. We already see now that these people don't smoke anymore. Then also this gap will decrease, right? So for two reasons we will see health convergence in old age. One, because there is health convergence there, and there's also health behavior conversion going on right now. And yeah, in the middle age, and what's going on there, the opioid epidemic is a disaster, but it's an exception to a general positive story. And it's not really something structurally wrong in the social system of the US, but maybe more something with a lobbyist system or something, but I hope this will be fixed. And overall, I think there's quite a positive outlook.
So at the very end, you're terming the opioid epidemic as something very sort of time limited, has some nefarious cause, whereas other people have argued that this actually has its origins in childhood. and it's manifesting itself in middle age with sort of various sort of mental health stressors that we see actually increasing. So not only is this middle age group going to continue to exhibit the negative effects of this as they age, but the younger cohorts, some people argue, are increasingly seeing these sort of mental health issues that have SES gradients in them, and this is only going to continue as we go forward. So some people argue this very much is structural and could counteract all of these other positive trends that you're highlighting.
No, that's a good point. I have to, I mean, it's definitely a fair point. I have to think about this. I think just what we make, I mean, there are these arguments that maybe pain is increasing or something, and that's why they're taking more pain medication. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at the opiate epidemic at least, I mean, this is heroin. I mean, this is like morphine, what they give to people when they have like some back pain, and they don't give it only for like, if they have a surgery, not only for 1 day, but for 2 weeks, and then they're on the hook. And it's just like, it's, I mean, some of my colleagues at Princeton do research on this, and if you look about like the history and the timeline, it's really, there is no question that you will have all of these people addicted, and it just seems to me that there could be these things going on, but I think the main story of the opiate epidemic is that the pharmaceutical companies somehow got, you don't think so? Okay.
I think it's much deeper.
Okay, but I mean, this is a good point, and it's definitely something to keep in mind, I think.
So what your argument has been that the between county inequality has been maybe converging a little bit. The simplest explanation for why that wouldn't correspond to the other studies is that, well, within county inequality is expanding. Is there any way that we can use your results to talk about what's happening within the counties, or are we just kind of left with a question mark about what's happening within counties?
So I think, yeah, we can't really do too much to look into the counties. It's just like, I mean, it's just like the data restrictions. And there's definitely this kind of question mark. At the same time, there has been a lot of kind of discussion about that places are left behind, and that there is disparity is growing also between like, between areas, and that there a lot of like the inequality that we see in the society is kind of like social inequality that's not only one person, but that's like neighborhoods, and that there are these multiplier effects. But I agree that like there is a question if we would see that, let's say, inequality within counties has strongly increased, but not between counties, then yeah, there could be like another dimension to that story.
Is there a way that the IRS and Social Security studies can address this, or is it not at the level of granularity that one can answer?
I don't know. So I think, I mean, the problem is that like the census data that is available in ICOMS and on the ACS that only has like bigger counties, but one could maybe try to just work with them and look, for example, there, whether like they compare for these bigger counties how the inequality has changed, and maybe repeat the same analysis only for those counties and see whether the mortality patterns are the same.
I guess the striking, is it Waldron, that kind of all the mortality improvement is happening to the upper 50% of the income distribution. I guess you have counties in which there are very few people in the upper 50% of the distribution that are nonetheless improving.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's also, I mean, that's the idea that like there are a lot of counties where we would clearly say they're just very poor. It's not just like that they're like extremely poor and extremely rich people, so they're just like counties where you really wouldn't want to live because it's very bad to live there. The people who live there are not very healthy. But I think yeah, this is kind of the main caveat of this approach. But we also like not. I mean, maybe I overemphasize it here, but I mean our main result is like looking at areas and comparing areas over time with same share of population in them. But of course, there is some scope, there is possibility that maybe within the areas a lot changed.
I have two questions. The first one is, I'm trying to think about how, so you use this grouping of counties based on income and poverty at the county level, because you think it's more stable than using education. But there's been a change too in county level poverty over the past 20 years. So the poor counties are probably much poorer, and rich counties are probably much richer. So we're trying to figure out how that might impact your results. And the second question is, I'm not exactly clear about your method to estimate the mortality values. So within each group, did you compute life stable or age specific mortality rates values for each county, and then you took some kind of average, or did you use the whole group and then computed the sum of all the data for the counties divided by all the population?
So I did the second. So I first formed the groups, and then I summed up all the deaths and summed up all the people, and then divided one by the other. And I mean, if mortality wasn't a rare event in some cases, then both should give you the same result, right? But I mean, it's just like that you have some counties with 0 deaths. It's better to sum them up. That was the second question, and the first one is that actually mortality poverty rates haven't increased so much. Like they have decreased to the 90s, and then in the late 2000s they increased. But overall, the overall, let's say, spread over counties hasn't increased so much. But then I think even if it had, it's not such kind of like it's not such a problem in a sense, because we are not interested in measuring people with the same poverty in one year and the other, but the same, like the people in the same part of the distribution. So the poorest 10% in one year with the poorest 10% in the next year. So for example, if everything improves and before the 10% poorest now suddenly is only 1% or something, right? And let's say their mortality hasn't improved, then it would be funny to say, oh, that society didn't get better, right? It's just like, I think it makes more sense to really say we compare parts of the distributions rather than people with a specific income or something.
Yeah, but you still get selection effects then.
Yeah, you would get different effects. And I think like both things, I mean, you could look at both things. And with our data, we could maybe also do the other thing. Maybe it would be just interesting to see how it would change. But I think overall, I think it should be more important to say how do the poorest 10%, how does their health change over time, rather than saying how does the health of someone with $10,000 per year change.
Well, it's two different.
Yeah, no, it's two different questions. Yeah, no, definitely.
I had kind of exactly the same question. Can you go to the slide 16, please? 16.
That's a long one.
Yeah, the 15.
15?
Yeah. So you're using exactly the same measure of poverty, exactly as you were saying, right? But there's like interaction and effect between inequality and poverty. So if you see, for example, the blue line, you can see like two specific groups in the poverty between 0 and 40, and then 60 to 100. So maybe a level of intensity of poverty could be interesting to check these kind of trends, because you clearly see positive lines according to the specific group of poverty. And that could be a noise because of this, because you have a specific change in poverty across time, and you are assuming that poverty is kind of stable. There actually is an interaction with inequality over there.
But what kind of interaction did you mean again?
In the sense that if you use a specific stable, like a fixed poverty line, you are not identifying how the poverty is affecting the changes in inequality in that specific period of time. And one way to measure that is to identify intensity of poverty. And that intensity of poverty could be identified in specific ranges of the poverty line. And that's something maybe that you can see here in that blue line, where you can see specific two groups over there. But it's just a comment.
Okay, maybe you can ask you more about the intensity afterwards.
I keep thinking that the percentile poor is highly correlated with rural urban, and also that the larger the county, the more poor people you're going to have in it. I mean, what you really do have here are places, not people. And what you're showing is changes in places that have certain kinds of people in them. But the larger places have lots of poor people, I don't know if they're more heterogeneous, but I'm just trying to parse what your argument is. So if it's rural, then what you're seeing is some big policy successes to the extent that the gradient is one that reduces mortality differentials among the poorest counties. That talks about the impact of federal public policies, actually, that would provide various kinds of resources, both at the household level, like SNAP, and at the community level, like neighborhood health centers or emergency access or whatever. But I'm not sure what happens when you've got really big places in there, because somewhere like the big New York counties, for example, have lots of very poor people who really do have much higher mortality rates than the rich people who live in those same counties. So it's a complicated argument. I mean, I think it's very interesting, but I do think it's important to keep distinct the difference between places and people and recognizing.
And I think this would be really interesting things for like future research to understand which forces are driving these developments, right? And just like, and I think overall it's just like, it's good to start with the notion that maybe there are things that have improved and that we want to pin down these areas of improvements, because in general, if we always just claim that everything is getting worse, then the average person in the street might just think, oh, nothing works, my tax money is wasted. But if you say there are areas of improvement and let's figure them out, and there are social policies that work, then people will maybe demand, let's scale up these policies and improve the lives of the poor. But yeah, of course, like, I think this is very aggregated, and there's much more to be done to understand what's happening.
Maybe we could take the last question.
Just I think along some of the lines, if the poor counties tend to be much smaller, is there a weighting problem? Is it possible that in this gradient, we're actually talking about a very small number of poor people at the low end, and even most of the poor people living in richer counties, so that this
So in general, it's like that this is kind of like a hump shape, the size. So we have more bigger counties in the middle and like smaller ones on the extremes. Also, because then you're more likely to have like a lot of rich, a lot of poor people. But in general, I think we also like for the very big ones we split them up into like to make them fit over several bins. And I think that's not like I'm not sure that's the problem, but maybe I should think about it.
Okay, thank you.